On a Saturday afternoon in June 1943, at a lake in central Florida, an American corporal set his loaded rifle against a pine tree, took off his boots, and waded into the water in his underwear. 12 German prisoners of war watched him from the shore. They had been told for 3 years that Americans shot prisoners on sight. They had been told the Americans were monsters, and now one of those monsters was floating on his back in Kingsley Lake, waving them in. Klaus Weber was 24 years old. He had surrendered in Tunisia 5 weeks earlier, believed, standing there on that sandy shore, that he was about to die. What happened next in that Florida lake would haunt him for the next 44 years. But to understand what happened at Kingsley Lake, you have to go back to a scorched hillside in the hills south of Cape Bon on the morning of May 13th, 1943, when the sun over Tunisia was white, not yellow. Klaus Weber remembered that detail for the rest of his life. White like bleached bone, white like the pages of the pocket Bible his mother had pressed into his hands in Munich 3 years earlier, white like the flags his commanding officer had ordered them to raise. Weber was 24 years old, Obergefreiter, 21st Panzer Division, 3 years in the Wehrmacht, 18 months in North Africa, and now standing on a scorched hillside in the hills south of Cape Bon with his rifle broken across a rock at his feet. He was about to become something he had never imagined he could become: a prisoner. The British tanks came up the slope in a slow line, Shermans, painted the color of dust. Weber counted 6 of them, then stopped counting because the number no longer mattered. Behind the tanks walked infantry in shorts and soft caps, rifles held loose, cigarettes in the corners of their mouths. They did not look like men expecting a fight. They looked like men who already knew how the day would end. Weber raised his hands. Beside him, a boy from Hamburg named Gruber was crying without sound. Gruber was 19. He had been in North Africa for 6 weeks. He had fired his rifle exactly twice, both times at nothing he could see. Now he stood with his hands above his head and tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. And Weber understood that Gruber was crying because he thought he was about to die. Everyone thought they were about to die. The propaganda had been very clear on this point. Dr. Goebbels had explained it in the newsreels that played in every cinema in Germany. The British shot prisoners. The Americans shot prisoners. The Russians did worse than shoot them. Surrender meant death, and surrender was worse than death in battle, because it was death without honor, death without meaning, death that would shame your family for generations. Weber had believed this. He had believed it for 3 years. And then a British corporal walked up the slopes, looked at the 140 exhausted, sunburned, half-starved men of Weber's unit, and said in accented German that anyone who was thirsty should raise his hand. Nobody raised a hand. They thought it was a trick. The corporal sighed, uncapped his canteen, and drank from it himself. Then he passed it to Gruber, the boy from Hamburg who was still crying. Gruber stared at the canteen for a long time before he took it. When he drank like a man who had forgotten what water tasted like, and Weber watched him and felt something inside his chest come loose. This was the first lie. The British did not shoot them. They did not beat them. They marched them down the hillside to a collection point where thousands of German and Italian soldiers sat under canvas awnings and ate corned beef from tins. They were counted, photographed, and given cigarettes. A medical officer looked at Weber's blistered feet and gave him a pair of clean socks. The socks were British Army issue. They were the softest thing Weber had touched in 18 months. He sat in the shade of the awning and put the socks on and tried to understand what was happening. Dr. Goebbels had been wrong. Dr. Goebbels had been wrong. And if Dr. Goebbels had been wrong about this, then Weber had to ask himself what else Dr. Goebbels had been wrong about. And that question was too large to hold in his head on that first afternoon of captivity. So Weber put it away in the back of his mind and did not touch it for a long time. 9 days at the collection point, then a train to Oran, then a ship. The ship was a Liberty ship, American-built and American-crewed, hauling 800 German prisoners across the Atlantic in cargo, holds that had been fitted with wooden bunks, stacked 4 high. The voyage took 17 days. Weber spent most of those 17 days lying in his bunk and trying not to be sick. The bunks were narrow. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed men and diesel oil and vomit. Twice a day, the guards brought food down into the hold, bread and stew and coffee. And twice a day, Weber ate what he could keep down and gave the rest to Gruber, who was in the bunk below him and who was sick for the entire crossing. At night, Weber lay awake and listened. He listened for the sound of a torpedo. Every man in the hold listened for it. The Kriegsmarine did not know that this ship carried German prisoners. The U-boats did not know. A single torpedo in the wrong hold at the wrong moment, and 800 German soldiers would drown in the dark under the North Atlantic, killed by their own navy, and nobody in Berlin would ever know they had died. Weber thought about this every night. Gruber cried every night. The ship moved north and west, and the water grew colder, and then it grew warmer again. And on the morning of June 1943, the engines stopped, and the guards came down into the hold and told the prisoners in broken German that they had arrived. Norfolk, Virginia. Weber climbed the ladder to the deck. He had lost 14 pounds during the crossing. His uniform hung on him like a curtain on a broken rod. He stepped out into the American sunlight and looked at the harbor. And the first thing he saw was a Coca-Cola sign painted on the side of a warehouse. The second thing he saw was cars, hundreds of cars. Cars parked in lots, cars driving on wide, clean streets, cars with chrome bumpers caught the sun and threw it back into the sky. Haber had not seen a private automobile in 3 years. In Germany, private automobiles had been requisitioned for the war effort. In North Africa, the only vehicles were military vehicles. But here in Norfolk, on a Wednesday morning in June, ordinary Americans were driving ordinary cars to ordinary jobs as if there were no war at all. This was the second lie. Dr. Goebbels had explained that America was collapsing. The American economy was in ruins. The American people were starving. The American war effort was a desperate bluff maintained by Jewish bankers and Roosevelt's lies. Any day now, the Americans would sue for peace because their society could not sustain a modern war. Weber looked at the cars. He looked at the warehouses stacked with crates. He looked at the American dock workers eating sandwiches thick with meat, wearing clean shirts, laughing at something one of them had said. He looked at a woman pushing a baby carriage down a sidewalk that had never known a bombing raid, and he just standing there in his stinking uniforms on the deck of the Liberty ship, that Germany was going to lose the war. He understood it in a single second, and he never stopped understanding it. The American military police marched the prisoners off the ship and onto a waiting train. The train was clean. The seats were upholstered. There were curtains on the windows. Weber sat next to Gruber and stared out at a country that did not look like a country at war. They traveled south. Virginia became North Carolina, became South Carolina, became Georgia. The land grew flatter and hotter. Pine forests replaced the rolling farmland of the upper South. Weber saw fields of tobacco and cotton being worked by men and women who waved at the train as it passed, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that the train carried enemy soldiers. On the afternoon of June 11th, the train stopped at a siding outside a small town called Stark, Florida. The guards told the prisoners to get off. Trucks were waiting. Weber climbed into the back of a canvas-covered truck with 11 other men, and the truck drove for 20 minutes down a sand road lined with pine trees, taller than any trees Weber had ever seen. The truck stopped at a gate. The gate was made of wire. There was a wooden guard tower beside it. A sign above the gate read, "Camp Blanding, Prisoner of War Compound." The guards checked papers, waved the truck through, and Weber rode into his new life without any real understanding of what that life was going to be. The compound was not what he expected. He had expected concrete. He had expected walls. He had expected the searchlights and the machine gun towers and the German shepherds straining at their leashes that he had seen in every propaganda film about Allied prison camps. Instead, he saw wooden barracks with tin roofs. He saw a mess hall with screen doors. He saw a chapel. He saw men in American field jackets marked with the letters PW walking around without chains, talking, smoking, playing cards at a picnic table under a live oak tree. The picnic table was the detail that stayed with him. Prisoners of war did not play cards at picnic tables. Prisoners of war suffered. That was the entire point of being a prisoner of war. You suffered until you died or until the war ended, and if you were unlucky, you suffered for a very long time. But these men were not suffering. These men were playing scat under a shade tree on a summer afternoon in Florida, and one of them was laughing, and the sound of that laughter was the strangest sound Weber had heard in 3 years. He was processed through the intake building. Photograph, fingerprints, medical exam, a shower, the first real shower he had taken since May, clean clothes, a canvas duffel bag with 2 blankets, a mess kit, a canteen, a razor, a bar of soap, and a small booklet in German explaining the Geneva Convention and his rights under it. His rights. Weber read the booklet standing in a hallway with wet hair and a duffel bag over his shoulder. He read it twice. He had never known he had rights. He had been a soldier for 3 years, and a soldier had duties, not rights. But the booklet said he had the right to adequate food. He had the right to medical care. He had the right to religious practice. He had the right to send and receive mail. He had the right to work for wages, 80 cents per day in canteen script. He had the right to be treated as a human being. Weber closed the booklet and put it in his duffel bag and walked out into the Florida evening, and a sergeant with a clipboard directed him to Barracks 14. Barracks 14 contained 20 cots, 20-foot lockers, and one German sergeant named Hoffman who had been at Camp Blanding for 2 months and who was sitting on his cot reading a paperback novel in English when Weber walked in. Hoffman looked up. He was perhaps 30 years old, thin-faced, dark hair, quiet eyes. He set down the book and studied Weber for a long moment. "Munich," he asked, "how did you know?" Hoffman smiled a small, tired smile. "Your accent and the way you stand." Munich men stand like they are always about to argue with somebody. Weber almost laughed. He stopped himself. "Tunisia?" Hoffman asked. 21st Panzer. Hoffman nodded slowly. "Afrika Korps. We have a lot of you here. He gestured at the cot next to his own. That one is empty. The man who had it was transferred to a work camp near Dade City last week. You can take his sheets. Weber sat down on the cot. It was soft, softer than any bed he had slept in since 1940. Surgeon, he said, may I ask you a question? You may ask. Is this real? Hoffman looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and pointed at something outside. Weber got up and looked. Outside, in the last light of the Florida evening, two German prisoners were walking together along a path between the barracks. They were carrying trays of food from the mess hall. They were laughing at something. Behind them, an American guard sat on a wooden bench, watching them without much interest, eating an apple. That is real, Hoffman said. The food is real. The barracks are real. The 80 cents per day is real. The Geneva Convention is real. He turned and looked at Weber. Everything they told us in Germany was a lie. Weber did not answer. He could not answer. He walked back to his cot, sat down, and stared at his hands. That night in the mess hall, Weber ate beef stew and white bread and canned peaches and drank coffee with real sugar and real cream. He ate more food than he had eaten in any single meal in 3 years. When he was finished, he sat at the long table and watched the other prisoners eat, and he watched the American guards eat the same food at their own table on the other side of the room. And he tried to understand what kind of country fed its enemies the same food it fed its own soldiers. He did not understand. He would not understand for a long time. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where he had put the question about Dr. Goebbels being wrong, another question began to form. It was a larger question, a more dangerous questions that he was not ready to ask, not on his first night at Camp Blanding, not with the taste of American coffee still on his tongue, and the softness of a real mattress waiting for him in Barracks 14. The question was this: if the Americans could feed him beef stew and give him a Bible, and let him sleep in a clean bed and pay him 80 cents a day to pick oranges, then what did that say about the war? What did it say about the men in Berlin who had sent him to North Africa to kill and to die? What did it say about the uniform he had worn and the oath he had sworn and the 3 years of his life that he had given to a cause that had told him lies about everything, about the British and the Americans and the Russians and the Jews and the entire shape of the world? Weber lay down on his cot in Barracks 14 at 10 o'clock on the night of June 11th, 1943, and he did not sleep for a long time. Outside, the Florida crickets were singing. Somewhere in the darkness, an American guard was whistling a song Weber did not know. The war was very far away, and Klaus Weber, 24 years old Obergefreiter, 21st Panzer Division prisoner of war, lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood, for the very first time in his life, that everything he had been taught to believe was going to have to be examined again from the beginning. The work began on a Monday. Weber climbed into the back of a truck at 7 in the morning with 50 other prisoners, and the truck drove west through pine country until the pine trees gave way to something he had never seen before. Orange trees, miles of them, row after row after row, stretching to a horizonus that shimmered in the heat, every tree heavy with fruit the color of a Bavarian sunset. The foreman was a man named Patterson, American civilian. Straw hat, sunburned neck, a voice like a piece of iron dragged across gravel. He explained the work through an interpreter. 30 boxes per man per day. Eat each box 100 pounds. Pick clean, do not bruise the fruit. Stack the boxes at the end of the row. Finish early, rest in the shade. Patterson said one more thing before he walked away. Boys, you work hard for me. I treat you right. You give me trouble, I give it back. That is the whole arrangement. Weber understood him without the interpreter. He started picking at 8:15. The Florida sun climbed, and the canvas bag on his shoulder grew heavy, and by 10 in the morning his shirt was black with sweat, and his arms ached in a way he had not felt since basic training. But there was something clean about the work, something honest. Reach, twist, pull, drop. No orders shouted in his ear. No shells falling, no man screaming for a medic in a language nobody spoke. Just oranges, and the sun, and the smell of citrus so thick it lived in his clothes for weeks. At noon they sat under a live oak tree, and the guards handed out sandwiches. White bread, cheese, some kind of pressed meat Weber could not name, and oranges, as many oranges as a man could eat. Weber ate 3, one after another, and the juice ran down his wrists and dried there in the heat, and he thought about the boys he had left in the sand at El Alamein who had died of thirst, who have dry tongues and cracked lips, and he could not make the two thoughts fit inside the same head. A guard sat down next to him. The guard was young, maybe 22, skinny, a private. He pulled a pack of Lucky Strikes from his pocket and offered one to Weber without saying anything. Weber took it. The guard lit it for him. Kowalski, the guard said, tapping his own chest. Weber! The guard nodded. Then, in slow, careful German, with an accent Weber recognized immediately, the guard said, My grandmother is from Regensburg. She taught me a little. Weber turned his head and looked at him. Regensburg was 90 miles from Munich. Bavaria, the heart country, the place where Weber's own grandmother had baked bread on Sunday mornings and sung old songs in a dialect that only old Bavarian women remembered anymore. And here, in the shade of a live oak tree in central Florida, an American soldier in American uniform was speaking to him in the accent of his own grandmother. Weber said nothing. He could not speak. He smoked the cigarette down to the filter and stared at the dust between his boots, and he understood something that Dr. Goebbels had never wanted anyone to understand. The enemy was not the enemy. The enemy was a boy from Pennsylvania whose grandmother had baked bread in Regensburg, and the only thing separating him from Weber was an ocean and a date of birth. The week ended. Saturday came, and Hoffman told Weber that some of the men were going swimming. Weber thought he had misheard the German. He asked Hoffman to say it again. Hoffman said it again. Swimming. Kingsley Lake. 2 oars, 12 volunteers. A truck at 2:30. Weber volunteered. Kingsley Lake was a perfect circle of water cut into the Florida sand, as if a giant had pressed a coin down into wet clay and lifted it away again. The water was clear to the bottom for the first 30 feet from shore, sand white as sugar, pine trees standing in dark ranks around the far side. The truck stopped at the edge of the beach, and the guards climbed out first. And Corporal Matthews turned and looked at the 12 German prisoners in the back and said one word. Swim. They did not move. They thought it was a trick. They thought it was a test. They thought the guards would shoot them the moment their feet touched the water, and their bodies would be dumped in the lake and reported as escape attempts, and their mothers in Munich and Hamburg and Cologne would receive letters that said their sons had died trying to run away. Matthews watched them for a long moment. Then he set his rifle down against a pine tree, took off his shirt, took off his boots, took off his pants, and walked into the lake in his underwear. He walked in up to his waist. Then he turned around and looked back at the truck, and he grinned, and he shouted something in English that Weber did not understand, but did not need to understand. The other two guards laughed. They set their rifles down beside Matthews's rifle, all three of them. 3 loaded American rifles leaning against a pine tree, unguarded 20 feet from 12 German prisoners of war. Weber climbed out of the truck. He walked down to the water. He took off his boots. He rolled up his trousers. And then, because he did not know what else to do, he waded out into Kingsley Lake in the middle of the war, and the water was warm, and it closed around his legs like something forgiving. And he ducked his head under the surface and stayed there for as long as his breath would hold. When he came up, he was crying. He did not know why. He did not want to know why. He wiped his face with the back of his hand so the others would not see, and he swam out to where Matthews was floating on his back in the deep water, and the two of them floated there together, an American corporal and a German prisoner of war, staring up at the same Florida sky. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. The summer became the autumn. The work shifted. In October, the citrus harvest slowed, and Weber's group was sent to a labor camp near Cleviston to cut sugar cane, and after that they were trucked to a construction site where a company called Pasco Packing was building cold storage warehouses for the war effort. Weber learned to mix concrete. He learned to lay brick. He learned to read blueprints in a language he was still learning to speak. And in the evenings, in the barracks, he read the newspapers. The Americans allowed the newspapers. Time magazine, Life, the Tampa Tribune. Weber read them all, and he studied the maps, and he understood before most of the other prisoners understood what those maps were showing. The Wehrmacht had lost at Kursk. The Italians had surrendered. The Red Army was moving west 100 miles a month. The Americans and the British were pushing up through Italy, and everyone on the maps was pushing toward Germany, and there was nothing pushing except boys younger than Gruber and old men older than Weber's father. Weber understood that he was watching the end of his country, and he understood something else, something he could not say out loud. He understood that he did not want to be repatriated. He did not want to be exchanged. He did not want to go home, because home now meant the Eastern Front, and the Eastern Front meant death, and Kingsley Lake meant life. He was safer as a prisoner of the Americans as he had ever been as a soldier of the Reich. He told this thought to no one, because the Reich had followed them across the ocean. He learned this in November. Hoffman took him aside one evening after supper, walked him behind the chapel where nobody could hear, and spoke to him in a voice so low Weber had to lean in to catch the words. "There are men in this camp," Hoffman said. "Who are watching?" Weber waited. SS men, party men, officers who still believe. They meet at night. They keep lists, names of prisoners who speak too warmly with the guards, names of prisoners who read too many American newspapers, names of prisoners who might be thinking the wrong thoughts. Hoffman looked at him with tired eyes. They call it the Court of Honor. If your name goes on the list, and if you are found guilty, they will kill you in your bunk. It has happened in Oklahoma. It has happened in Arizona. It could happen here. Do you understand me, Weber? Weber understood him. "Say nothing," Hoffman said. "Read your newspapers alone. Do not laugh with WWII where other Germans can see you. Do not swim in Kingsley Lake if you can find a reason not to. The war is over for us, but it is not over for them, not yet." That night, Weber lay in his cot in Barracks 14 and stared at the ceiling, and he understood that he was still in the war after all. He was in it in a way he had not expected. The enemy was no longer across an ocean. The enemy was 3 cots down, sleeping under an American blanket, dreaming of a Führer who was already dead in a bunker Weber could not yet imagine. Outside the window, Kingsley Lake lay dark and still under a Florida moon, and Klaus Weber closed his eyes and did not sleep, and he understood that even paradise had teeth. The war ended on a Tuesday, May 8th, 1945. Weber was mixing mortar behind a warehouse near Dad City when a guard came running down the row of prisoners shouting the news in English. Germany had surrendered. Berlin had fallen. The thing that Weber had known was coming for 2 years had finally arrived, and he stood there with a trowel in his hand and mortar drying on his wrist, and felt nothing at all. Not relief, not grief, not shame, nothing. He had already mourned Germany 1,000 times, alone in his cot at night, and there was nothing left inside him to mourn with. He set the trowel down. He walked to the water bucket. He drank. He went back to work. That evening, the guards gave the prisoners extra cigarettes. Nobody smoked them. The barracks were quiet. Hoffman sat on his cot and stared at his hands, and Weber sat across from him, and neither of them spoke. The court of honor did not meet that night. There was no honor left to defend. 3 days later, the rations were cut. The meat disappeared first, then the eggs, then the coffee, and potatoes and thin soup, meal after meal, and the prisoners began to lose the weight they had gained on Florida beef. Weber lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks. His trousers hung on him again, the way they had hung on him in Tunisia. Colonel Hayes called an assembly. He stood on a wooden platform in front of 800 German prisoners, and he read from a paper in his hand. And his voice was steady, but his eyes were somewhere far away. Photographs have been released, he said, from the camps liberated by American and British forces. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The American public has seen these photographs. Congress has responded. Rations for German prisoners of war are being reduced across all facilities in the United States to the minimum permitted by the Geneva Convention. He paused. I disagree with this policy. I have said so to Washington. Washington did not ask my opinion. I am telling you this so that you understand that the men who have guarded you here did not choose this. It was chosen for us. You will continue to receive humane treatment. But the extra food is over. The recreation is reduced. The privileges are ended. He looked out over the assembled prisoners. I am also required to show you a film. Attendance is mandatory. The film is being shown tonight in the recreation hall. That is all. The film ran for 42 minutes. Weber sat in the 3rd row on a wooden folding chair, and the screen at the front of the hall flickered to life, and for 42 minutes, as Klaus Weber watched things that no human being should have to watch. Bulldozers pushing bodies into pits, skeletons in striped uniforms who were still alive but should not have been, ovens, piles of shoes, piles of hair, piles of gold teeth. A woman in Bergen-Belsen who looked into the camera and could not speak because her tongue no longer worked. Nobody in the recreation hall moved. A prisoner 2 rows behind Weber began to make a sound. It was not crying. It was something older than crying. A low, broken keening, the sound of a man whose whole world was being cut out of him without anesthetic. Nobody turned to look. Nobody comforted him. Every man in that hall was somewhere alone inside his own head, trying to make the images on the screen fit into a life that could still be lived afterward. Weber sat very still. He had not been at those camps. He had not guarded them. He had never seen them, never known where they were, never fired a rifle at a Jew or a Pole or a Russian civilian. He had been in North Africa, fighting British tanks in the sand, but he had worn the uniform. He had sworn the oath. He had believed once, when he was younger, that the men who ran his country knew what they were doing. He had picked up his rifle in 1940 and marched under the same flag that flew above the gates of Dachau. And when the film ended and the lights came up in the recreation hall, Klaus Weber understood that there was no clean way to have been a German soldier. There was no version of his life in which his hands were not touched by this. He walked back to Barracks 14 in the dark. He lay down on his cot. He did not sleep. The repatriation began the following spring. It was slow. There were too many prisoners and not enough ships. And the ships that existed were needed for other things. Weber's name did not come up on the transport list until March of 1946. He rode a bus to Jacksonville with 300 other men. He boarded a Liberty ship, the same kind of ship that had brought him across the Atlantic 3 years earlier, and the crossing took 14 days, and he spent most of it on deck staring at the water. The ship did not dock in Germany. It docked at Cherbourg in France, and the French authorities were waiting. Weber and the others were marched off the ship into a fenced compound, and a French officer read them a document in 3 languages. Germany owed reparations. Germany had destroyed France. The German prisoners in French custody would remain in France as laborers for a period to be determined, working to rebuild what German armies had broken. Weber spent 4 months breaking rocks in a quarry outside Rouen. Not complain. There was nothing to complain about. He had been fed beef stew in Florida for 3 years while some Frenchmen starved under German occupation, and if France now wanted 4 months of his labor in exchange, France was owed considerably more than that. He was released in July. He rode a train east through a landscape that had been fought over 3 times in his lifetime, and he crossed into Germany. And Germany was not a country anymore. Germany was a rubble field with borders drawn on it. Every town he passed through was broken. Every station was crowded with people who had nowhere to go, refugees from the east, widows with children, old men pushing carts that held everything they still owned in the world. He reached Munich on the 3rd of August, 1946. He walked from the station to the neighborhood where he had grown up, and the neighborhood was not there. The buildings were piles of brick with weeds growing between them. He found the address of his mother's apartment on a wall that no longer had a building attached to it. A neighbor recognized him, told him where his mother was living now, a basement 3 streets over, under a building that had partially collapsed. He went there. He knocked on the door. His mother opened it. She was 52 years old. She looked 70. Her hair was white. Her hands shook. She stared at him for a long moment as if she could not quite believe he was real. And then she reached up and touched his face with fingers that felt like paper. And she told him that his father had been killed in an air raid in October of 1944, and his younger brother had been killed at a place called Kustrin on the Oder in March of 1945. And she was the only one left, and now he was here, and that was enough. She did not cry. She had run out of crying a long time before. Weber moved into the basement with her. He found work clearing rubble, 10 hours a day for a pay envelope that barely bought bread. He used the skills he had learned building warehouses for Pasco Packing in Florida. He mixed mortar, he laid brick. He rebuilt a city that had taken 1,000 years to build and 6 years to destroy. He never spoke about Florida. When neighbors asked where he had been during the war, he said North Africa,
Then he said he had been a prisoner, and then he stopped because he did not know how to explain to a woman whose husband had died at Stalingrad that he had spent his war swimming in a Florida lake and picking oranges under a live oak tree while a boy from Pennsylvania offered him Lucky.
He kept one photograph. It had been taken at Kingsley Lake in June of 1943. 12 German prisoners standing wet on a sandy shore, smiling like men on holiday. Weberso was second from the left. He kept the photograph, hung up his drawer of his desk for the rest of his life, and he did not show it to his wife when he married in 1949. And he did not show it to his children when they were born, and he did not show it to anyone. He looked at it sometimes, late at night, alone. He tried to understand what it meant that the men who had lost the war had been treated with more mercy than they had earned, and the men who had won the war had been the ones to give that mercy, and none of it made the dead that's less dead or the ruined cities less ruined. Yet the photograph existed, and the mercy had been real, and something in him refused to let it go. Klaus Weber died in Munich in September of 1987. He was 68 years old. His children found the photograph in the drawer when they cleaned out his desk. They asked their mother what it was. She told them their father had been a prisoner of war in America. She told them the Americans had been kind to him. She told them that this had been a gift he had never known how to repay, and that he had carried it quietly for 44 years. The photograph now hangs in a small museum in Munich, in a room dedicated to the German soldiers who came home from the war and had to learn how to live inside the peace. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. They should stop, because that photograph is the whole story. 12 men who were told their enemies were monsters. 12 men who were shown for 2 hours on a summer afternoon in 1943 that the monsters were only men. And one of those men carried the memory home to a broken country and never spoke of it. It's because he did not have the words, because there are no words, because sometimes the only honest thing a man can do with mercy is to hold it in his hands and marvel that it existed at all. Thank you for watching. If this story reached you, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Help us keep these memories alive. There are more stories like this, and they are waiting to be told.